let's start first with the general characteristics of organisms which are included under kingdom Animalia. So what are the general features? First and foremost, all organisms which are included under this particular kingdom are eukaryotic. You know what eukaryotic means. Eukaryotic organisms are those organisms which have a well-defined nucleus. Other than that, organisms included under this particular kingdom are multicellular, which means several cells are going to form the organisms which are categorized under kingdom Animalia. So they are eukaryotic, they are multicellular. Another very important feature of organisms included under this kingdom is absence of cell wall. They do not have a cell wall. Like plant cells and fungus and some bacteria, they do have a very prominent cell wall. But animal cells lack a cell wall. They do not have a cell wall. The animals also show prominent locomotion, which means that they can show movement, except for few which are going to be sedentary, which means they are attached to a substratum and they cannot show any movement. But let me tell you, most of all animals are going to be the ones which can exhibit locomotion, except for few lower animals which can be sedentary, like sponges. Other than this, let me tell you that these organisms have well developed systems, specifically organ systems, as you go up into the most evolved phylums of kingdom Animalia. If you see the lower phylums of kingdom Animalia, you will observe that they do not have well developed systems. But as you move ahead in the phylums in kingdom Animalia, you will see that their organ systems go on developing, right? So you will see that how well developed systems, especially respiratory system, digestive system, excretory system, nervous system, they develop across phylums. The lowest of all phylums may not show you some prominent characteristics, but as you move ahead, you will see that these systems are going to become very well developed, and you will see peculiar organs that you have studied in case of humans as well. Other than that, let me tell you that these organisms show response to stimulus, and that is because of the nervous system that they have, the sense organs that they have, because of which they show a very prominent response to stimulus. Other than that, also we need to discuss that most of the organisms here are consumers. They are not autotrophic, they cannot synthesize their own food, so they depend on other organisms, which means that they are heterotrophs. Let me tell you that some of them can be predators, which means that they feed on another organism, which means they capture a prey and consume them up. Some are going to be parasitic, which means that they feed on their host. Okay, some of them are going to be saprophytes, which means they feed on dead and decaying matter, right? So they could be predators, they could be parasitic, they could be saprophytic. So these are the different types of animals that we have under kingdom Animalia, right? Now let me tell you that what would be the basic feature on the basis of which we will classify animals. There has to be some specific criteria, right? उस criteria के basis पर ही हम organisms को classify कर सकते हैं. So ये कौन से criterias है जिनको use करके हम animals को classify करते हैं is what we have to study here. So let us study what are the basic criteria for classification. So there are total 6 criteria that we need to study, on the basis of which we will categorize animals into different phylums and different classes. So what are those criteria? Criteria for classification. Let us begin with the first criteria. The first criteria is grades of organization. The second criteria is going to be symmetry. The third criteria is animal body plan. The fourth criteria is going to be coelom, which is also known as body cavity. The fifth criteria is going to be germinal layers. And the sixth criteria is going to be segmentation. So these are the 6 criteria on the basis of which we are going to classify animals. The first one is grades of organization. The second one is symmetry. The third one is animal body plan. The fourth one is coelom or body cavity. The fifth one is germinal layers, and the sixth one is segmentation. Let us study each of these criteria one by one. Let us begin with the first criteria, which is grades of organization. So some animals, some organisms are going to have just individual cells. So we call it as cellular level of organization. उनमें टिश्यू या ऑर्गन नहीं होता. हम बहुत अच्छे से जानते हैं कि जब भी हम किसी ऑर्गेनिज्म के बारे में बात करते हैं, an organism is made up of something called as organ system, right? It's made up of organ system. Organ systems are made up of organs. Organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells, right? So we know that cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up organ systems, and organ systems make up organism. Now if you talk about respiratory system, we know that human respiratory system starts with the nostril, you have the nasal cavity, you have the pharynx, you have the larynx, you have trachea, you have lungs, you have alveoli, you have bronchi, so many different parts, right? All these parts make up the respiratory system. But these organs or these parts are made up of certain tissues, and these tissues are made up of certain cells, right? So in some organisms you can find only cells. So you call them as cellular level of organization. In some you have cells as well as tissues, so you call them as tissue level organization. In some you have tissues and organs, you call them as organ level organization. So आपको ये तीनों कैटेगरी के ऑर्गेनिजम्स किंगडम एनिमेलिया में दिखाई देंगे. कुछ ऐसे होंगे जिनके पास सिर्फ सेल्यूलर लेवल ऑफ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, कुछ ऐसे होंगे जिनके पास टिश्यू लेवल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, कुछ ऐसे होंगे जिनके पास होंगे ऑर्गन लेवल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन. ओके, the second criteria on the basis of which we will classify organisms is called as symmetry. Now let me tell you that there might be organisms जिनको तुम किसी भी एंगल में काटो, किसी भी एक्सिस में काटो, आपको इक्वल हाफ्स नहीं मिलेंगे. अगर आप ह्यूमन बीइंग की बात करो, यू कैन कट आवर सेल्स इन द सेंट्रल एक्सिस, और जब आप अपने आप को सेंट्रल एक्सिस में काटते हो तो आपको 2 इक्वल हाफ्स मिलते हैं. ऐसे सिमेट्री को हम बोलते हैं बाइलैटरल सिमेट्री. क्या बोलते हैं उसको? बाइलैटरल सिमेट्री. So if you see the image here, यहाँ पे उन्होंने बीटल का इमेज दिया हुआ है. So आप उसको अगर सेंट्रल एक्सिस में काटोगे तो आपको बीटल के 2 इक्वल हाफ मिलेंगे. Even in case of humans, we have bilateral symmetry, right? So when you cut an organism along the central axis and you get 2 equal halves, you are going to refer to it as bilateral symmetry. Now if you cut an organism along any axis, along any plane, and you get 2 equal halves, then you are going to call it as radial symmetry. What do you call it? You call it as radial symmetry. So you can find this in organisms like Hydra. I'm sure that you have learnt about Hydra in your lower classes, and I'm also sure that you have heard about starfish. So all this show radial symmetry, which means that you cut them along any axis, along any plane, you are going to get 2 equal halves. So ऐसे symmetry को हम बोलते हैं radial symmetry. और अगर आप किसी organism को किसी भी axis पर काटो, किसी भी plane पर काटो, अगर आपको 2 equal half नहीं मिलेंगे तो उस type के symmetry को हम बोलेंगे asymmetry. What do we call it? We call it as asymmetry. So best example here in case of asymmetry is going to be sponges. Okay, so in case of symmetry, We have three types. If you cut an organism along the central axis and you get two equal halves, you're going to refer to it as bilateral symmetry. If you cut it along any axis, along any plane, and you get two equal halves, you call it as radial symmetry. And if you cut it along any axis, any plane, and you're not getting any two equal halves, then you call it as asymmetry. For example of bilateral symmetry, we have spoken about humans and beetle. For radial symmetry, we have taken example of hydra and starfish, and for asymmetry, we have taken example of sponges. Let us discuss the next criteria for classification of animals. So the next criteria is animal body plan. Let me tell you that in some organisms, cells are going to be present individually. They carry out all processes individually, but they are not going to be responsible for bringing about functions together. Okay, they are going to be present individually there as single cells there. Okay, और वो एक तरीके से division of labor तो कर रहे हैं, लेकिन वो सारे cells साथ में एक organism makeup नहीं कर रहे. They are as good as individual cells. Okay, ऐसा जो body plan है उसको हम बोलते हैं cell aggregate body plan. Okay, what do we call it? We call it as cell aggregate body plan, wherein cells are going to be present singly. इसके लिए भी I think the best example that I can give you is sponges. So these are individual cells. They are going to carry out their functions, but it is very difficult to refer to them as, you know, as an organism as a whole. They are all performing their functions. Then if you talk about the second type of body plan, it is called as blind sac body plan. Now what is blind sac body plan? In case of blind sac body plan, let me tell you that there is a common opening, and that common opening is going to function as both. It is going to function as mouth as well as anus. यानी कि this is an opening from which they will take in food, and this is the same opening through which they will give out their excretory products. तो ये एक ही opening है जिसमें से वो खाना consume भी करते हैं और waste products बाहर भी निकालते हैं. ऐसा जो body plan है उसको हम बोलते हैं blind sac body plan. What do we call it? We call it as blind sac body plan. The best example for this would be organisms like hydra. Okay, and then we have a third body plan which is called as tube within tube body plan. So यहाँ पर from the image itself you can see that the example quoted is fishes, and let me tell you that it is also seen in humans. Okay, so fishes and humans, they show you tube within tube body plan. Now why do we call it as tube within tube body plan? Please understand that our body itself is a cylindrical tube, and within that there is another tube which is our gastrointestinal tract. It has two openings. It has an opening which you call as mouth, and the another opening is what you call as the anus. From the mouth you take in food, from anus you're going to release out the excretory products, right? So because your body itself is cylindrical, and inside that there is another tube which has two openings, an opening through which you take in food and another opening through which you give out excretory products, that's the reason why we call it as a tube within tube body plan, which is seen in all higher organisms, including, for example, what we have taken here is fishes and humans. So there are three types of body plan. One is called as the cell aggregate body plan. The another is called as the blind sac body plan, and the third is what we call as the tube within tube body plan. Okay, so moving ahead, we are going to now discuss the next criteria for classification, and the next criteria is what we basically call as coelom. Now what is coelom, students? Coelom is nothing but body cavity. Okay, so a body cavity is what we call as coelom. Now let me tell you, all organisms may not have a true body cavity. There are some organisms which lack a body cavity completely. They do not have a coelom. Such organisms are what we call as a coelomate, because the letter A here stands for absence. So they do not have a body cavity, because of which you call them as a coelomate. We have taken example of flatworms. flatworms do not have a true body cavity, because of which these organisms are going to be referred to as a coelomate. Okay, now let us talk about the next type. You have something called as eucoelomate. U stands for true. So these are those organisms which have a true body cavity. For example, annelids, earthworms are the best example. So they have a true body cavity. Also, humans are going to be eucoelomate because we do have a true body cavity, right? And then we have something called as pseudocoelomate. Pseudo stands for false. So these are those organisms which seem to have a body cavity, but it's not a true body cavity, because there are going to be pouches of cells because of which it does not have adequate space. So we refer to it as pseudocoelomates, or the ones which have a false body cavity. Here the example is of nematodes like Ascaris, which can cause infections in humans. So we have three categories. We have acoelomate. These are those organisms which do not have a body cavity, which do not have a coelom, which we have taken example of flatworms. And then we have eucoelomate, which have a true body cavity, for which we have taken examples of annelids like earthworms and also of humans. And then we have spoken about pseudocoelomates. These are those organisms which do not have a true body cavity. They have a false body cavity, because of which we call them as pseudocoelomates. An example are of those organisms which are included under the phylum Nematoda, and for example Ascaris, right? Now we are going to the next criteria of classification, which is germinal layers. Let me tell you that there are three germinal layers when you talk about humans. Yes, we have an inner germinal layer which is called as endoderm. So you can see here, endo stands for inside. Okay, so the inner germinal layer is what we call as endoderm. Then we have a middle germinal layer which is called as mesoderm. Meso stands for middle. And then we have outer or the external germinal layer which is called as ectoderm, because ecto stands for outside, right? So the innermost germinal layer is called as an endoderm, the middle germinal layer is called as a mesoderm, and the outer germinal layer is called as an ectoderm, right? So we have three germinal layers. All higher organisms have three germinal layers. So organisms which have three germinal layers, we call them as triploblastic. Okay, all organisms, all higher organisms, you talk about humans, you talk about fishes, you talk about rats, all these are triploblastic organisms. These have three germinal layers, right? And you talk about diploblastic organisms, all lower organisms are going to be diploblastic, okay, right from our sponges to hydra. All these are diploblastic organisms, which means they have only two germinal layers. The inner germinal layer which is called as the endoderm, the outer germinal layer which is called as the ectoderm, and between ectoderm and endoderm they have a non-living substance which we call as mesogloia. What do we call it? We call it as mesogloia. It's a non-living substance which is present there instead of mesoderm. Okay, so in all lower organisms we have only two germinal layers, and we call such organisms as diploblastic organisms. And in all higher organisms we have three germinal layers. We have the outermost, which is ectoderm, we have the middle. Now we will start with the next criteria for classification of animals, which is segmentation. You will see that animals like earthworms, their body has segmentation. If you carefully observe this diagram, you can see these boxes which are nothing but body segments of earthworm. Now let me tell you, all organisms will not have a segmented body. Some are going to have segmentation on their body, and such organisms will be called as segmented organisms. While there are going to be some other organisms which will not have any segments on their body, and they are called as unsegmented organisms. Now let me tell you students that in case of segmented organisms, the segmentation is not just external. Segmentation is going to be such that the division is even internal. यानी कि जो segment है वो सिर्फ externally appear नहीं करता, वो segments अंदर भी होते हैं. और ऐसे type of segmentation को हम बोलते हैं metameric segmentation, which is clearly seen in earthworms. let me tell you that in case of earthworms, I can very clearly tell you that which segment has which organ below it. This is basically possible because the external segment corresponds to the internal segments. So because of this arrangement, it is very much possible for me to say that below the 12th segment, I am probably going to have the ovaries, or below the 14th segment, I am going to have the testes. So it is very, very possible for telling or for predicting that what kind of organs are going to be present under which segment because of metameric segmentation, as the segmentation is not just external, the segmentation is also internal. So these are the different criteria on the basis of which we classify organisms. We discussed about the grades of organization, wherein we said that the organism would be either having cellular level of organization or tissue level of organization or organ level of organization. Then on the basis of symmetry, we can classify organisms as asymmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical or radially symmetrical. On the basis of the body plan, we can classify organisms as the ones having blind sac body plan or cell aggregate body plan or tube within tube body plan. On the basis of the presence of body cavity or coelom, we can call them as coelomates or acoelomates or pseudocoelomates. On the basis of the number of germinal layers that they have, we can call them as diploblastic or triploblastic organisms, and on the basis of segmentation, they are either segmented organisms or they are unsegmented organisms. Moving ahead, now we are going to start with the very first section of classification, where it's very important for you guys to understand these two terms. So let us see what are these two terms. We have something called as chordates and we have something called as non-chordates, right? Also, we very commonly come across the term vertebrates and invertebrates. So let us understand what's the difference when I use the term chordates and vertebrates or non-chordates and invertebrates, for which first I need to know what do I mean by non-chordates or what do I mean by chordates. Chordates are those organisms which have a rod-like structure called as notochord. So a presence of a notochord in an organism indicates that these are chordates, while absence of a notochord classifies them as non-chordates. So those who have a notochord are called as chordates, those who don't have a notochord, they are called as non-chordates. Now your question should be, sir, what do you mean by a notochord? So notochord is a primitive form which then gets modified to form a vertebral column. You know what vertebral column is, our spinal cord, right? So please understand, notochord से ही vertebral column बनता है. Notochord रहा तो obvious है कि vertebral column भी बनेगा. लेकिन अगर notochord ही नहीं रहा तो it's a very good question that vertebral column कहाँ से बन पाएगा, right? So non-chordates are those organisms which are not going to have a notochord, while chordates are those organisms which are going to have a notochord. Now let us discuss about invertebrates and vertebrates. Invertebrates are those which do not have a vertebral column. Okay, they do not have a vertebral column, they lack a vertebral column, hence they are called as invertebrates. While vertebrates are those which have a vertebral column, and that's the reason why they are called as vertebrates. So invertebrates are those which do not have a vertebral column and vertebrates are those which have a vertebral column, right? Now you would say that, sir, okay, we understood what non-chordates are, what chordates are, what invertebrates are, what vertebrates are, but what is the relationship between these? Please understand, non-chordates do not have a notochord, so they cannot get a vertebral column क्योंकि notochord से ही vertebral column बनता है. So non-chordates are basically going to be invertebrates. Okay, so those who are non-chordates, they are going to be invertebrates. Okay, but if I talk about chordates, these organisms have a notochord, right? But let me tell you that there are some chordates which have notochord only in their juvenile state, only in their bachchu state, only in their childhood. But as they grow into an adult, they lose their notochord. Or they have notochord throughout their life which never gets modified into a vertebral column. So such organisms which may have notochord for a short period of time or whose notochord does not get modified into a vertebral column, such chordates are called as chordates which are invertebrates. Okay, and there are going to be yet other chordates in which their notochord gets developed into a vertebral column, so they are going to be chordates which are vertebrates. So all non-chordates are going to be invertebrates, no doubt about it. But in case of chordates, there are going to be some organisms which will have notochord for a short period of time, or which will have notochord only throughout their life, which will never get modified into a vertebral column. So such chordates would be referred to as invertebrates, and there will be some chordates whose notochord will get modified into vertebral columns, so they will be called as chordates which are vertebrates. Okay, so our basic kingdom Animalia has been divided largely, broadly into non-chordates and chordates, and we are going to start with non-chordates first, under which we have total 10 phylums, and we are going to begin with the very first phylum, which is phylum Porifera. Okay, so please take a note of it that what we are starting with is called as kingdom, or rather phylum Porifera, under a particular category which is called as non-chordata. So under non-chordata, we are going to start with the very first phylum, which is called as phylum Porifera. Okay, now please understand that this word Porifera is made up of two words, porin and ferin. Porin stands for pores and ferin stands for bearing. So these are those organisms which have several pores on their body, because of which they are called as Porifera. So porin का मतलब है pores, ferin का मतलब है bearing. So these are those organisms which are going to have several openings, minute openings, which we call as pores. Okay, now let me tell you that these organisms are going to be solitary or they are going to be colonial. Now what do you mean by this? Solitary are those organisms जो अकेले रहेंगे. अगर वो अकेले पाए जाते हैं तो उनको हम बोलते हैं solitary, और अगर वो झुंड में पाए जाते हैं, if they are found in group together, we call them as colonial. So if they are found alone, we call them as solitary. If they are found in groups together, we call them as colonial. Okay, they are basically found in aquatic ecosystems, so they either can be found in freshwater or they can be found in marine ecosystems. So they are found in both. They can be found in freshwater systems like lakes, like rivers, and they can be found in marine water systems like oceans, right? Other than that, when we come to its characteristics, let me tell you that their body is cylindrical, which means it's a tube-like structure. So they have a cylindrical body, and let me tell you that they have a cellular grade of organization. So you can see the first criteria of classification is cellular grade of organization. They are made up of different types of cells. They do not have tissues or organs here. So they show cellular grade of organization, and they have several small openings on their body. Throughout the length of their body, they have these small openings which we call as ostia. And let me tell you that ostia से वो पानी और खाना अंदर लेते हैं. Also exchange of respiratory gases happens through the body surface itself. So there are going to be millions of these ostia which are present on the body surface, through which they take in water, and along with water they ensure that they take in nutrients as well, right? And let me tell you, their body cavity is called as spongocele. So because it's the body cavity of sponges, it is referred to as spongocele. Okay, they have a single large opening which is called as osculum. So ये एक ही बड़ा ओपनिंग है जो टॉप पे होता है ऑर्गेनिजम्स के, उसको हम बोलते हैं osculum. Osculum is that opening through which they flush out all water, and along with water all the waste materials are going to be given out through the osculum. So सारा पानी और खाना छोटे छोटे ओपनिंग्स में से आते हैं जिनको हम बोलते हैं ऑस्टिया, और पानी के साथ सारे वेस्ट प्रोडक्ट्स को एक कॉमन बड़े ओपनिंग से बाहर रिलीज किया जाता है जिसको हम बोलते हैं osculum. Okay, now let me tell you that these organisms have an endoskeleton. Now what do you mean by this, students? Please understand that skeletal framework or skeleton is that which something provides support to our body matrix. हमारे बॉडी को शेप देने के लिए, हमारे बॉडी को सपोर्ट प्रोवाइड करने के लिए skeleton is a very very important component. skeleton दो टाइप के हो सकते हैं, exoskeleton हो सकता है, endoskeleton हो सकता है. endo stands for inside. So जो skeletal components हमारे बॉडी के अंदर होते हैं, we are going to call them as endoskeleton. For example, in case of humans, you have cartilages, you have bones, all this is going to be part of endoskeleton, right? But whatever skeletal components are there on the outside, like our skin, hair, all that is going to be exoskeleton. एक्सोस्केलेटन का एक और बढ़िया एग्जाम्पल होगा कॉकरोचेस. अगर आप कॉकरोचेस को देखो, दे हैव अ वेरी टफ बॉडी कवरिंग व्हिच इज मेड अप ऑफ अ नाइट्रोजनस पॉलीसैकेराइड व्हिच इज कॉल्ड एज काइटिन. ये इतना टफ बॉडी कवरिंग बनाता है जिसकी वजह से आप कॉकरोचेस पर अगर अटैक भी करोगे, यू विल सी दैट दे आर एबल टू सस्टेन दैट अटैक. You know why they are able to sustain that attack? They are able to sustain that attack because of this tough exoskeleton material which is chitin, which will protect their internal body organs. So there could be exoskeleton, there could be endoskeleton. In case of sponges, we have internal skeletal components which are called as endoskeleton, and let me tell you that this endoskeleton is made up of calcium carbonate. So they are called as calcium carbonate spicules because they are like spikes, they are like thorns, okay, spicules, or there are also silica spicules or silica spikes, and there are also spongin fibers. So all these are going to form the endoskeleton of sponges. So it could be made up of calcium carbonate, which we call as calcium carbonate spicules, or it could be made up of silica, which we call as silica spicules, or it could be made up of spongin, which we call as spongin spicules. After understanding this, let me tell you that as far as the digestion is concerned, digestion in sponges is going to be intracellular, which means they take up their food material inside the cell and then they are going to break it down. So whenever digestion takes place inside the cell, we call it as intracellular. Whenever digestion takes place outside the cell, wherein the cell will release enzymes to break down the food material outside and then take up the broken products, is what we call as extracellular digestion. But in case of sponges, we have intracellular digestion, wherein the food material is first taken inside and then it is broken down. So it's called as intracellular digestion. Let me tell you, sponges feed on detritus food material. Detritus food material means dead and decaying matter. So they feed on dead and decaying food material, that is also called as detritus food material. They do not have any special digestive system. Okay, so digestive system is absent because cells are carrying out digestion at an individual level, so they do not have a special digestive system present over here. Okay, now let me tell you that there are three types of cells in sponges. The first cell that we have is what we call as choanocytes. Then we have something called as pinacocytes, and then we have something called as amoebocytes. Choanocytes basically are responsible for intracellular digestion. They are responsible for absorbing food material. They have, let me tell you, flagella or cilia like structure, which is wavy structure, जिसकी rhythmic movement के वजह से waste materials जो है वो आगे के direction में फेंके जाएंगे, धकेले जाएंगे, और ये सिर्फ उनको जो ज़रूरी है वो nutritious material अंदर absorb करते हैं, उसको break down करते हैं. So they are responsible for digestion, and their cilia or flagella like structure is going to ensure that all waste products are going to be excreted out through the osculum. Okay, so their basic function is going to be intracellular digestion. and other than that, excretion. And as far as spinacocytes are concerned, these are cells which are present on the external surface of the sponges. So these cells line the entire external surface of the sponges. Okay, so the structural formation is because of something called as spinacocytes, and then we have amoebocytes which store food. So they are responsible for storing all reserve food material so that whenever food is necessary, amoebocytes can provide the food that it has been storing inside it. So choanocytes, spinacocytes and amoebocytes. Moving ahead, let us speak about its reproduction. So let me tell you that poriferans have asexual mode of reproduction. Asexual mode of reproduction is by fragmentation and gemule formation. So fragmentation यानी आप sponges को कितने भी टुकड़ों में divide कर लो, हर टुकड़े से एक नया sponge आ सकता है. और gemule formation की अगर हम बात करें तो ये बिल्कुल budding की तरह होता है. Parent body के ऊपर there is going to be a very small outgrowth, a very small bud which will then detach eventually from the parent plant, and that single bud can give rise to a whole organism. So if you divide the organism into different small pieces, into different fragments, and every fragment gives rise to a new sponge, then you call the process as fragmentation. And if there is a small bud through which a new sponge can be formed, then you call it as gemule formation. Also let me tell you that sponges have a very high power of regeneration. ओके तुम उसको कितने भी टुकड़ों में बांटो वो आपको नए स्पॉन्जेस देते जाएंगे. हम में ऐसा नहीं होता, अगर तुम एक ह्यूमन को दो टुकड़ों में काटो, यू आर नॉट गोइंग टू गेट टू ह्यूमंस, राइट? बट देयर आर ऑर्गेनिजम्स वेयरइन यू कट देम इनटू टू हाफ्स, यू गेट टू न्यू ऑर्गेनिजम्स. दैट्स कॉल्ड एज रीजनरेशन, एंड दीज ऑर्गेनिजम्स हैव अ वेरी हाई पावर ऑफ रीजनरेशन. Let me tell you, sexual reproduction is also seen in sponges, and sexual reproduction is by gametes. Okay, and fertilization in them is internal. So they exhibit internal fertilization. So male is going to produce the male gametes, and it is going to be released into the water, and through the water current these gametes are going to enter the female body, and inside the female these two gametes are going to fuse together, and because fertilization takes place inside the female body, that's the reason why we call it as internal fertilization, because there are going to be some organisms in whom the fertilization is going to take place outside, because both the male and the female are going to release the gametes outside. So fusion of the gametes in them takes place outside, because of which it can be called as external fertilization. But in case of sponges, the fertilization is going to be internal. Okay. Now let me tell you what are the examples under this category. So we have Sypha, we have Euspongia, which is also popularly called as bath sponge, and Euplectella. Okay. Now let us have a look at the images. So you can see this is phylum Porifera, जिसमें हम जो पहला organism पढ़ रहे हैं, that is sponges. Okay, so these are sponges. So what you see here on the body, scale like जो structure है, you can see it is the epidermal cell which is called as spinacocyte, right? Then they have shown you choanocyte on the internal end, which has this flagella or hair-like structure that you can see. There are several small pores on the body. Each of these pores is called as ostium. These are smaller pores, okay, and these are called as incurrent pores also, क्योंकि इन छोटे opening से पानी जो है वो अंदर जाएगा. So क्योंकि पानी इनके through अंदर जाएगा, इसलिए इनको कहा जाता है incurrent pores or ostium. And there is an opening at the top which is a large opening called as osculum or excurrent pore, जिसमें से सारा जो waste product और पानी है वो साथ में release किया जाएगा. Because all water is going to move out, we call it as excurrent pore, and because water is going to move inside through ostium, we call it as incurrent pore. The cavity of the sponge is called as spongocele. It can also be called as atrium or paragaster. You can also see that ostium is formed by a cell which is called as porocyte or the pore cell, right? You can also see amoebocyte, which is mentioned over here, which is responsible for storing food. So let us move ahead. Let us see the structure in detail. So if you can see, this is the choanocyte through which you have the flagella-like structure. You can see it has been named as flagellum, whose rhythmic movement is responsible for creating water currents so that new water can enter in and the old water with excretory products can be thrown out. There is also mesohyl, which is a semi-fluid matrix which is responsible for holding the choanocyte. You can see choanocyte at the base also has a nucleus. You can also see the silica spicules, which is the endoskeleton in case of sponges. Let us see some more images. This is cycon. They are seen in very beautiful colors in the ocean. They are cylindrical structures. You can see lot of cilia-like structures at the top, and this is nothing but the osculum. Okay, so this is the common opening through which excretory products are given out, and on the body, throughout the body, there are going to be lot of ostia, right? Then you can see spongilla, which has green colored tree branch like structures, again found at the base of the ocean, look very beautiful again. Euspongia, this is very popularly also called as bath sponge. ये कमर्शियली नहाते वक्त यूज़ किया जाता है. तो बाथ स्पॉन्जेस जो है, यूस्पॉन्जिया जो है, उसको ओशन में से निकालकर सुखाकर ट्रीट करके उसको बाथ स्पॉन्ज की तरह मार्केट में बेचा जाता है, बिकॉज यू यूज इट फॉर स्क्रबिंग योर बॉडी व्हेन यू टेक बाथ, बिकॉज इट इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर रिमूविंग ऑल डेड सेल्स फ्रॉम योर स्किन. So people use bath sponges. It can be commercially purchased from the market, right? So these are going to be dead sponges which are going to be treated and sold. Then we have Euplectella. It looks cottony structure, cylindrical structure, looks very beautiful. It's also called as Venus flower basket by many people. Let me tell you, these are also found on the ocean floor. Most of the sponges are sedentary, which means that they are attached to a substratum and they cannot move. They are not motile. They are going to be attached to the base. Okay, so this is about sponges, and poriferans, phylum Porifera comes to an end over here, and now we are moving to the next phylum, which is very important phylum, which is called as phylum Coelenterata. So let us speak about this phylum, which is called as phylum Cnidaria. This is the name which is used in your textbook, so I want you to know this name as well. But let me tell you that it is very popularly also called as phylum Coelenterata. Okay, so Cnidaria and Coelenterata. Let us first talk about the examples of this organism. There is a huge list of organisms here. You have Hydra, which you have been learning from school time. You have Aurelia, and I'm sure that if I tell you the common name of this organism, you will very easily recognize it. Aurelia is very commonly called as jellyfishes. Now I'm sure that you know about it. Physalia, then you have Adamsia, then you have Diploria and Gorgonia. So now let us first speak about the general characteristics of Cnidaria or Coelenterata. First of all, let me tell you, they are either colonial, which means they are found in groups together, or they are going to be solitary, which means they can be found singly or individually. ओके तो अगर अकेले देखे गए तो हम उनको सॉलिटरी बोलते हैं, अगर झुंड में देखे गए तो उनको हम colonial बोलते हैं. They can be either attached to the base, they can be attached to the substratum, because of which we call them as sedentary, and some of it could be even free living, which means they would be free swimming, they are motile. Okay, so some are sedentary, some are free swimming or free living. They are found in both fresh water, okay, as well as in marine water. Other than that, let me tell you that they show tissue level organization. So now this is a very important point, because in Porifera we said that those organisms show cellular level of organization, but we are saying that coelenterates are going to show you tissue level organization. So can you see there has been an evolutionary change wherein from cellular level organization these organisms have gone ahead to form tissue level organization. Right now, let me tell you that these organisms have blind sac body plan. Now, blind sac body plan, which means mouth and anus are going to be the same opening. I know it sounds very weird, right? We can't even imagine wherein the mouth and anus are going to be the same opening. They have a blind sac body plan. Other than that, let me tell you that their body cavity is called as coelenteron. Because it is Coelenterata, their body cavity is called as coelenteron. Okay, coelenteron is responsible for carrying out not just digestion but also circulation. So these two are functions of coelenteron, digestion and circulation. let me tell you that these organisms are found in two body forms. उनके दो body structures हो सकते हैं. एक है tubular form जिसमें वो tube like body structure होता है उनके पास. So tubular form को हम बोलते हैं polyps. और दूसरा है umbrella shaped body, okay, जिसको हम बोलते हैं medusa. So they can have two body forms. One is going to be tubular body form, which is called as polyps, and second is going to be umbrella shaped body form, which is called as medusa. Let me tell you that polyp is the juvenile stage, the childhood stage. So जब वो बच्चे होते हैं तो they are going to be in the tubular form, which we call as polyps, and as they grow into adults they get converted into medusa. Let me tell you that polyps to medusa can also be seen as an asexual mode of reproduction. यानी polyps जब asexually reproduce करते हैं तो वो medusa form देते हैं, और medusa जब sexually reproduce करते हैं they are going to give rise to polyps. So they can also be seen as an alternate generation, wherein one generation is seen as polyps, which when asexually multiply they give rise to medusa, and medusa when sexually reproduces gives rise to polyps. ये जो है conversion जो है जहाँ पर एक generation is seen as polypoid generation, okay, and the other generation is seen as medusoid generation. So one generation is seen as polypoid and the other generation is seen as medusoid. This is called as metagenesis. What is it called? It is called as metagenesis, conversion from polyp to medusa and then medusa to polyp. ये जो alternation होगा generation का, इसको हम बोलेंगे metagenesis. Now please understand students that other than this, we have to understand that these organisms have a nerve net which is spread throughout the length of the body. So this is the beginning of the nervous system, wherein the entire length of the body is covered by a diffuse structure of nerve net. Okay, other than that, let me tell you that they are going to have tentacles. These tentacles basically are useful for locomotion and also for capturing prey. Now here is a very important point, students. These tentacles are going to have stinging cells which are called as nidocytes, and nidocytes पर एक structure होता है जिनको बोला जाता है nematocyst, which will release toxin. So they use their tentacles to capture the prey. They have long tentacles and they will just curl their tentacle around the prey and they will capture the prey. On the tentacle, there are going to be nidocytes. These are specialized stinging cells which have structure called as nematocyst, which release toxin. Okay, so normally the tentacles are wound and they are present inside a spring-like structure is going to hold it, but the moment the organism feels that there is a prey around it, it's going to release that tentacle and the tentacle will capture the prey, and when it curls around the prey, let me tell you that these nidocytes are going to release toxin into them using the nematocyst. Now why do they release toxin? It's a very important aspect. When any predator tries to capture the prey will try to escape. It does not want to be bound in a position. The prey will try to save itself. It will try to escape. Because of this, these organisms, they release a toxin. This toxin is a paralyzing toxin which is going to paralyze its entire system, because of which this organism cannot move. It cannot show any kind of movement. It is going to be paralyzed. Now it is very easy because the prey will not move at all and it's easy for these organisms to eat it up. तो वो छटपटाएंगे ही नहीं, वो भागने की कोशिश नहीं करेंगे, क्योंकि इनमें टॉक्सिन रिलीज कर दिया गया है जो उनको पूरी तरीके से पैरालाइज कर देगा. लेट मी टेल यू दैट इवन ह्यूमंस जो स्कूबा डाइविंग करते हैं, उनको स्कूबा डाइविंग के ट्रेनिंग के वक्त ये बताया जाता है कि जेली फिशेस या ऐसे ऑर्गेनिजम्स जिनमें बड़े टेंटिकल्स दिखे उनसे दूर रहना चाहिए. कुछ जेली फिशेस का वजन टन्स में होता है स्टूडेंट्स, उनके जो टेंटिकल्स है वो किलोमीटर लॉन्ग हो सकते हैं, और वो इतने बड़े टेंटिकल्स जब हमारे स्किन को भी टच करेंगे ना, दे विल रिलीज द टॉक्सिन इन अस एंड वी विल गेट पैरालाइज्ड देन एंड देयर. और वहां पर अगर पैरालाइज हो गए इतने डीप ओशन में, इट इज गोइंग टू बी इम्पॉसिबल फॉर द पर्सन टू कम अप. सो वो ब्रेथलेसनेस से वहीं पे मर जाएगा. Okay, so scuba divers are going to be taught that to stay away from tentacles, to stay away from jellyfishes. They look very beautiful in different colors, they are very adorable, but उनके नजदीक जाना is going to be like losing your life, okay, because of these nidocytes or nematocysts. Moving ahead, let me tell you that these organisms are going to show you both asexual as well as sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is by budding, and also let me tell you that they have a very high power of regeneration. While sexual reproduction is by producing gametes. Okay, so asexual reproduction is by budding, wherein they form a bud on their parent body and the bud is going to be released off to give rise to a new coelant trait, or they also have a very high power of regeneration. Sexual reproduction is by forming gametes, fusion of gametes, and that's how reproduction takes place. All corals and coral reefs, they belong to Coelenterata phylum. तो जो beautiful corals होते हैं जिसके लिए लोग scuba diving करते हैं to see these corals which look beautiful in different colors, let me tell you, all corals and coral reefs are belonging to phylum Coelenterata. Unfortunately, let me tell you that because of pollution of water bodies, these coral reefs are getting bleached, they are getting destroyed. और अगर ऐसे ही चलता रहा, let me tell you that the marine ecosystem is going to be completely damaged and destroyed, because corals have a very important role in maintaining balance in the marine ecosystem. Let us see